Okay, let's start this webinar. Welcome to this C2I webinar, at which we will learn more about a new instrument in the fight against climate change, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. My name is Maria Nikolova, I'm Communication Officer at E2I, and I'll be your host today. As you know, the European Union has set itself a difficult task to accomplish. Reduce CO2 emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The achievement of these goals would make the European Union a world pioneer in climate policy. However, to reach these targets, various policy instruments have been suggested in the European Green Deal, with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism being one of the most important but also more controversial ones. This mechanism would put a carbon price on imports of certain goods from outside the European Union. The aim would be to reduce the risk of the so-called carbon leakage by protecting EU companies against cheaper imports from countries with weaker climate policies, and at the same time counteract the transfer of production and jobs from the EU to those countries. According to the European Commission, this instrument would be an alternative to the free emissions allowances allocated under the EU emissions trading system, ETS, which have attracted a lot of criticism. Following many years of discussions, this new policy instrument is now scheduled to be adopted in the second quarter of next year. However, the proposal remains controversial with respect to its effectiveness at addressing the problem of carbon leakage, its political and legal feasibility, and its practical implementation, benchmarks, and scope. At this E2I webinar, we have invited 3 speakers who have looked at the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism from different angles and will share with us their views on whether or not they consider it an important instrument of the European climate policy in the near future. In the discussion afterwards, we will try to also look at some of the questions you have already submitted with the registration form, which concern a broad range of issues referring to the design and implementation of this mechanism, its relation to the ETS, the best allocation of the revenues raised, possible alternatives, as well as policies that could be implemented in parallel. As you can see, that is quite something that we will try to do over the next hour. So without further ado, I will present the speakers and give them the floor. We are very glad to have Mathilde Dupré with us today, who is the co-director of the Veblen Institute for Economic Reforms in Paris. Georg Zachmann, who is senior fellow focusing on energy and climate change issues at the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel. And last but not least, Benjamin Denis, policy advisor on industrial policy at IndustriO, and former policy advisor of the EQC on climate and energy issues. So, as I said, I'm not going to take any more time, so I'll give the floor immediately to Mathilde.
Yeah. I'm just trying to share my slide. Hello. Well, I will share all my screen. Sorry for that. Hello, so I am co-director of the Veblen Institute, and we are a think tank based in Paris working on the economic and financial reforms that we need to achieve a fair, democratic and ecological transition. And within the Institute, I am in charge of a program on the reform of the EU trade policy. So, well, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism has already been introduced, so I will go directly to the question, why is it important? So first of all, because this is one way of addressing the issue of imported emission and the EU's overall climate footprint. And from our point of view, the Commission Green Deal starts from an excessively optimistic assessment of our ability to decouple economic growth from the pressure on natural resources and greenhouse gas emissions. The communication recalls that the EU has reduced its emission by 23% between 1990 and 2018, while achieving 61% GDP growth. But if we take imported emission into account, the reduction of the emission is much slower than the pace announced by the Commission. So this result is not surprising and reflects the EU status as a net importer of emission. 1/3 of the total EU total emission footprint comes from the emission incorporated in imports. And this proportion is likely to increase further with the Green Deal's plan to digitalize the European economy. So in any case, the current rate of emission reduction is absolutely not compatible with the objective set up by the EU in the Green Deal. This is why, as a net CO2 importing region, a border adjustment mechanism would prove to be relevant for the European Union's climate objective. But this measure is far from a magic solution, and it only makes sense if it helps to mobilize all stakeholders, all EU member countries, our trading partners, the private sector, to significantly increase efforts to reduce emissions. So we think that there are some prerequisites for setting up a border carbon adjustment mechanism. The first one is to raise the domestic price of carbon, the European price of carbon. So in order to meet our climate objective, the first priority is to achieve high level of carbon pricing within the Union. And this will have to be done for energy intensive sector through the European emission trading scheme. So this allocation price should increase along with the ambition of the EU climate policy. There are new estimates around the new 2030 targets that are on the screen. Well, we've been rather witnessing a rapid fall in the price of carbon COVID crisis. It showed again some major flaws in the system. So we should start first introducing a CO2 floor price in order to avoid such fluctuation. And this measure should be included in the reforms plan for the phase 4 of the EU ETS. And also we need to abolish the free allocation system, because in this respect, well, while the Commission announcement seems rather clear, this is not necessarily the case for the position of the member states, and in its initial proposals put forward by France, the latest seemed to consider that the establishment of a carbon carbon adjustment mechanism could coexist at least temporarily with the distribution of free allowances. Now, what are the main challenges for the implementation of such a mechanism? There are first some technical issues about the way to assess the carbon content of the products, because number of products consist of multiple elements from different parts of the world, and it will be complicated to determine their carbon content precisely. So in order to estimate it, it would be necessary to know the environmental rules applicable in each country, as well as the production processes used by the companies concerned, and the way it evolved. So an option could be to take as a default reference value the carbon intensity of the similar world production sector by sector. But even so, the method still presupposes knowledge of the production processes, and this kind of information, that companies do not wish to publish. So, however, these technical difficulties do not justify the status quo. We had the same challenges when we started to build the EU ETS. So we must strengthen traceability in parallel with the gradual introduction of a CBAM to have the data necessary for the proper functioning of this mechanism. And I wanted to mention here one specific point, because we've heard some agricultural unions that could be interested in setting up a CBAM also in the agricultural sector. And for our part, we consider that this solution is not the right solution, because the carbon metric alone does not seem relevant and could even prove counterproductive, given the impact of the use of plant protection products on the destruction of biodiversity, for instance. We should also take into account this dimension in addition to the carbon footprint. And last thing, there are some legal issues. because the proposal will have to be carefully crafted to be compatible with the provision of the World Trade Organization rules. So as regards this important question, several studies have answered that it was possible, but there is no precedent. So we lack the necessary insight to prevent any risk of conflict. And the methodology chosen and the political choices regarding the abolition of free quota and the use of the revenue could be decisive in removing any objection on grounds of discrimination from non-European players. So what are the criteria for success? We should show the necessity and the proportionality of the mechanism. So we need to demonstrate the risk, the reality of the risk of carbon leakage and the lack of an equally effective alternative. So this is something that the European Commission is normally doing in the impact assessment that it is preparing. And free allocation, which are generally presented as the alternative, have over the year demonstrated their ineffectiveness. They have not led to any efficiency gains or progress in energy transition for the beneficiary industries. And this is because the free allocation scheme leads to an incomplete pass-through of carbon costs into the price of carbon-intensive products, leading to insufficient redirection of demands towards low-carbon products. Then we also have to show that the system is fair. So the custom duty compared to the internal ETS system has to be aligned with the European price per ton of CO2. And we need to take into account the carbon price already existing in third countries and to develop some efforts to try to align our mechanism with other carbon pricing systems. So for instance, we could launch negotiation with country or regions that have already carbon pricing system in place. And we could present our mechanism as a temporary measure that would be used until countries have equivalent pricing measure in place. And then we need to show transparency and predictability. So we need to use an average default value, as I said before. EU average value would be the easiest solution, but the global one would be maybe fairer. And we need to allow third country producers to demonstrate better performance regarding this average default value. So here, an independent assessment agency financed with a part of the from the revenue could be an important element of the system. And last but not least, there are of course some political challenges. We need to learn from the previous failure, because since 2007, 3 adjustment proposals have been debated at the European level, and the impetus in particular of France. And previous projects have all failed because of the opposition of some private actors and some member states which preferred the maintaining of free allowances. So for this reason, many observers have tended to say that it is unlikely that this part of the Green Deal project will ever see the light of day. So internally inside the EU, first of all, it is more promising to frame it as an adjustment mechanism rather than a tax. Because an adjustment mechanism would mean a kind of custom duty, and therefore it would have to be decided by qualified majority in the Council and under the co-decision procedure with the Parliament, whereas the introduction of a uniform tax at the Union's border would indeed have required the unanimous agreement of all the member states. And then there are also some external challenges, because this measure might be perceived as a disguised form of economic protectionism and could trigger some retaliation answers. So countries such as India and China have repeatedly indicated that they would systematically take action at the World Trade Organization if any country were to introduce a carbon tax or border adjustment measure. And the threat of retaliation was also confirmed by US Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross at the end of January in Davos. So we need clearly here to be able to justify the mechanism as a mechanism aiming at protecting the environment, and not to present it as an instrument at the service of policy of the competitiveness of the European industry. And another way to show the EU good faith is also the way we will use the revenue, not for the European budget, but to facilitate the intervention of an independent agency to calculate the carbon content of the product, and also to help finance the ecological transition in third countries and in developing countries in particular. So this is far from being agreed, because it seems to be a sensitive issue, and the European Commission has already announced its intention to use the revenue to repay the loan from the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund. Maybe last thing, least developed countries exporting to the European Union would have legitimate reasons to consider this measure as a disproportionate burden on them. So we should provide exemption for least developed countries. And as a conclusion, I just wanted to say that this mechanism could be tested first on limited products and limited sectors whose production is both highly localized, energy intensive, and highly exposed to international competition, including cement, steel, aluminium, and then it could be progressively extended. And also, of course, this path should not be exclusive, and other normative options should also be explored to prohibit access to the European market for products that are too polluting or too emitters, such as agricultural raw material that contribute to imported deforestation, for instance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mathilde, for giving us already such a good overview of the broad array of issues that are at stake regarding this mechanism. Maybe you can you stop sharing the presentation, please? Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I hope that afterwards in the discussion we can have some time to go more into detail into some of those issues that you mentioned. But now I would like to give the floor to Georg Zachmann from Bruegel, who wrote this very interesting paper, European Carbon Border Tax, Much Pain, Little Gain. Maybe he can tell us more why he thinks that. So Georg, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks Maria and ETI for, okay, now you can see me. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the invitation to speak here. Indeed, we did a paper in the first half of 2020, and as the title suggests, we essentially want to highlight that we think that the risk and cost of implementing a carbon border tax are essentially higher than the benefits. And in the presentation, I would like to essentially point or make three arguments. The first argument is that the problem that can be addressed with carbon border adjustments is smaller than is often argued in the debate. The second point is that the cost and risk of implementation are really big, and I think Mathilde already showed a bit how complex it is going to be. And then I would argue that better alternatives than a carbon border mechanism or a free allocation of allowances are going to can be made available. Now on the evidence on the carbon leakage. Here, there's essentially two strands of literature. One strand of literature tries to look into existing climate protection or environmental protection schemes and tries to understand how much leakage happens because one country has higher standards than another country, so how much industry leaves. And this empirical literature so far has no conclusive evidence. So you do not find very strong or evidence at all that that industries are essentially leaving because you have stronger climate protection in one country than another. So far, what Mathilde has discussed about the import of emission-intensive goods, that's a fact, but that's due to trade pattern. That's because China is exporting this sort of things, and it's exporting them not only to the EU with tight climate protection, but it's exporting them everywhere, and it's not due to European climate protection. The other strand of the literature is modeling work. So here you essentially calibrate models with your things that you think happen in an economy, and then a lot of these modeling exercises find that yes, in a perfectly working international trade, what you would find is that if you put a higher price on carbon in one place, then some industries might move over to other places. But these models often assume kind of very flexible trade. So that's it's calibrated as Armington elasticities. We don't have very clear understanding how they actually look in reality. And the interesting fact is that if these models introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the leakage does not necessarily go away entirely. Only about half of the leakage can be addressed with carbon border adjustment, because the other half of the leakage is essentially due to the so-called energy price channel. So what happens here is Europe consumes less energy because of its emission trading system. And then what happens is energy gets cheaper internationally, and then other countries like the US and China use more energy. And you can introduce as many carbon border adjustments as you want. You're not going to treat that issue of indirect leakage, as it is called, at all with carbon border adjustments. So even if the modeling were true, then still half of the leakage cannot be dealt with. So then we argue based on that we have fairly insignificant leakage rates in reality. Half of that is indirect leakage. Leakage is concentrated in a very few sectors, but those sectors are not really what's driving our economy. So they are typically characterized by low labor and low value added. And even within those sectors, leakage is limited. And if you assume that some of those sectors will stay where their markets are, I think it's fair to assume that we will not lose our entire steel and aluminium industry if we introduce higher carbon prices. On the other hand, I said the cost and risk of implementation are significant. So I see essentially two ways of introducing a carbon border adjustment. The first way is we introduce a comprehensive carbon border adjustment. So we try to identify for each piece or good that we import the carbon content of it. That's going to be an incredibly complicated exercise. So just think about data centers somewhere else in the world that are using the electricity. So are you going to pay a carbon border adjustment for data that is processed elsewhere? Other things is you still do not get away from trade deviations that happen here. So if, for example, currently Ukraine exports very dirty steel to the European Union. Now you introduce a very comprehensive carbon border adjustment. What happens is that Ukraine might export the steel to Georgia, and Georgia might export more clean steel to the European Union. So you essentially create more emissions by longer trading chains without solving the initial issue. Moreover, in terms of calculation, how do you assess, for example, the electricity sector of one country if it is used for using goods further down the value chain? Do you take the average emissions of the system? Do you accept if the steel plant in the other country says, no, I run only on the two wind plants that are here in Morocco? Or do you assume, no, it's essentially the last power plant in the country, which is a coal-fired power plant that produced the electricity? These judgment calls will have huge effects, and it will be quite difficult to legally and economically properly define what is happening. The alternative to that is you say, okay, there's only a few sectors like steel, cement, aluminium that are really the big guys, and for those you introduce a sectoral carbon border adjustment mechanism. The issue here is something like that has been tried by the US. So the Trump administration essentially put tariffs on steel and aluminium imports only. And the result of that has been massive trade deviation. So the US reduced its imports of steel and aluminium due to the tax, but US producers didn't produce more. Because what actually happened is that then the US started to import more nails and drawing pin staples and other products that are produced from steel. So you might in the end lose your lose your high value production line because you differentiate the prices between clean and dirty steel in other countries. So both alternatives are difficult. On the legal issues, I think Mathilde made a clear point that that it will be quite difficult for some of the dreams of high carbon revenues in the EU budget, carbon border revenues in the EU budget to become reality, because that might kill the legal case for the carbon border adjustment. On the political concerns, I think here's my biggest concern. The problem is that if in 2 or 3 years we are ready to go live with the carbon border adjustment, and then the US administration again puts a lot of pressure on us and says, okay, we are closing the US market to the German car imports because of that, just because we can do it, then will Germany blink or not? So will we have invested all our political capital into a mechanism that in the end 1 or 2 member states might block because of their domestic interest in not going so far? And therefore, I'm quite worried to overly emphasize the possibility of introducing a carbon border mechanism in the end. Next point is alternative mechanisms. So I fully concur with Mathilde that free allowances are not a good alternative mechanism. Free allowances have led to massive redistributional effects in the EU. We calculated, I think, something 20 to 30 billion euros that have been distributed from consumers to producers through free allowances. And that's something that that should not happen much further down the road. No, but what we think of is what we really want to achieve is bring down the cost of low carbon technologies. And that will not only help Europe in becoming competitive, but it will essentially also help globally decarbonization. So that's the real thing that we want to go for. So use the money that we receive from domestic carbon pricing and try to support low carbon steel, low carbon cement, introduce mechanisms that are available for installations that are situated or located in the European Union, and make this investment cycle about an investment cycle into green sectors to prepare for the 21st low carbon century. To conclude, I think I argued that carbon leakage is somewhat limited, and it should not receive much more political attention than it merits to. My big worry is that we attach too much weight to it, and that if we make a Jungtim out of a carbon border adjustment mechanism and increasing carbon prices, we might end up in a situation in 2-3 years down the road where, due to outside political pressure, we are not allowed to introduce carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and therefore we are not going to increase our carbon pricing. So I would strongly urge us to decouple the two things, go ahead with increasing carbon prices domestically, try to find domestic ways to support low carbon steel and aluminum and cement making, and we can still work on a carbon border adjustment mechanism as a threatening tool to our partners, so that smaller countries like, for example, Ukraine or Morocco think about decarbonization domestically. But I think we should not bet on the ultimate implementation of this thing, because that might backfire bigly. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much, Georg. Yeah, it was clear from your presentation. It became clear that it is clear that this is a very complicated issue, and so I think we'll give the floor now to Benjamin for the position of the unions, and more specifically IndustriO, on this. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm just looking for my presentation, which doesn't appear immediately because maybe I have 2 other windows opened. Let me clean a little bit the mess. Too many balls in the air. Okay. So here we are. Can you see the presentation on the screen, Maria?
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon.
Put it, just one, maybe put it in presentation mode. Yeah.
Like that?
Yes.
Okay, I had some notes in my presentation that I cannot see like that, but I will try to manage.
Oh, yeah.
Don't worry. So good afternoon to all of you, and thank you to Maria and the ETUI for the invitation. Carbon border adjustment mechanism for us is an important topic in the context of the Green Deal. We don't know yet what our final position will be as industrial. We have submitted a couple of months ago an answer to the inception impact assessment that the Commission launched, but it's a preliminary analysis made by the Secretariat. And we have launched a process of consultation with our members to try to propose and provide a more detailed analysis. And many of the questions that have been mentioned by the two previous speakers are at the core of our discussion, because indeed, as Maria mentioned, it's a quite challenging and complicated discussion. But as you can see on the screen, the two questions that I would like to address with you today are the following: why do we need a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and how such a mechanism could be implemented, bearing in mind again that we don't know yet what the Commission will exactly propose, and many uncertainties remain. What is, however, quite clear at this stage is that the Green Deal and the climate agenda is really high on the political agenda of the current European Commission. It's clear from the mission letter that Ursula von der Leyen published like 1 year ago, and it's also clear in the different speeches and communications that the top leaders of the current Commission have already published. We will experience and go through a needed intensification of the EU decarbonization pace in the coming years. The most visible and tangible consequence of that ambition is probably the increase of the 2030 target from 40% to 50%, and if possible 55%, which would put the EU climate ambition more in line with the Paris Agreement mandate. However, when we look at what the emissions look like, it's obvious that reaching the minus 40% is already a bit of a challenge for the EU. According to the official data published by the European Environmental Agency based in Copenhagen, with the current policies, but also with the policies that member states have planned and announced in their draft ADCPs, the EU is currently not on track to reach minus 40% by 2030. And in that context, the EU is currently discussing to bring the 2030 target to minus 50, and if possible, minus 55%, which is quite an important jump, an important increase of ambition. All those estimates have been done, of course, before the COVID crisis, and it will be interesting to see whether the current situation will have an impact on emissions and on the climate ambition. One of the key questions also to open in that context is, what will be the impact on the EU ETS, the EU emissions trading system? We might expect, if the EU would decide to move to 50-55% increase of the target for ETS, which is currently minus 43% compared to 2005, and according to estimates that are currently circulating, minus 50-55% could bring the ETS target to 52 and maybe 57% for 2030. It might also mean an increase of the linear reduction factor from 2002 for the phase 4 to 3.2 to 5.2%. It's quite important increase. And last but not least, it's complicated to quantify, but we can assume that all these things will have an impact on the carbon price in the coming years as well. Carbon price is of course important to be considered in the global context. We are now, and it will be the case for a while, in a situation where we do not really have a global carbon price. We have actually a situation made of a lot of asymmetries and differences between major economies. To try to fix that problem, multilateralism and international, if not universal, rules would be our preferred option, to have an international trade and fair trade regulated by rules. But obviously, little prospect of, there is very little prospect of significant progress in the short and medium term. The last major agreement in the international trade has been adopted in 1994, and since then multilateralism, especially in trade, seems to be stuck. It's also important to keep in mind that the Paris Agreement has not created a universal carbon price. The only legally binding obligation for country parties to the treaty is to submit an NDC, a national plan, every 5 years, and the level of ambition must increase every 5 years. But there is nothing which really would ascribe to all the country parties to the treaty a quantified objective in terms of emission reductions. And as you know, some big players have decided to leave the Paris Agreement. Always under the UNFCCC discussions, discussions on the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the article creating systems where countries can discuss and agree on market and non-market mechanisms. Those discussions have been the most challenging to implement the Paris Agreement. And all those elements and the difficulty to link the EU ETS with similar systems in other regions, in other major economies, all those elements confirm that the kind of intensification of emission reduction within the EU that I referred to will have to take place in a global context where carbon price, universal carbon price will be a concept without implementation for a while. For all those reasons, I really believe, and this is maybe a first difference with Georg, I think that the starting point we are using to discuss the carbon price is not what happened during the last decade. We know that during the last decade, emissions from the energy-intensive industries in Europe have been flat. It might mean that we are reaching the limits of what can be achieved with the current system, the prevailing approach, made of relatively low carbon price and free allocation. That system succeeds in protecting the EU industries from carbon leakage, but it failed in triggering the kind of breakthrough, the rollout of breakthrough technologies among industries in Europe. And from that perspective, we really believe that if we want to be able to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, we need another approach. And in that context, we see the carbon border adjustment mechanism as one element, one enabling factor among others that might make the deep decarbonization of energy-intensive industries feasible. So we have a kind of ex-ante perspective to discuss the carbon border adjustment mechanism, whereas as far as I understood, Georg have more an ex-post analysis, but we can go back to that point in the discussion. What we also believe important is to have the right level of granularity when discussing the carbon adjustment mechanism. It might be useful indeed to have the broad picture and to use a macroeconomic modeling exercise to anticipate the consequences of such a system. But we also believe that it must be based on a more granular analysis sector by sector. And among the sectors that are the most exposed to the consequences of decarbonization in a global context without a global carbon price are energy intensive industries. And if you look at the energy intensive industries, it's quite well documented now. There are a cluster of technologies that can be identified to deeply decarbonize those sectors. Hydrogen, CCS and CCU, electrification, energy intensive, energy efficiency and circular economy can play a role as well. But most of the time we are discussing the same family of technologies. Different things are important to bear in mind. In many of the sectors energy intensive, the technologies that can be envisaged to reach deep decarbonization are not deployed yet. For some of the sectors we are talking about, the technology readiness level is relatively low. They are not ready yet to be deployed at industrial scale. It means that the deployment of those technologies will require significant upfront investment. It's also obvious from the existing literature that the operational cost of those technologies are most of the time much higher than the currently used technologies. And if we want to make a business case for those technologies, the carbon price must be put at level much higher than the current price on the EU ETS. And you can see, for instance, on the slides, some graphs and some calculations made by Agora Energiewende. This is for Germany, but you can see similar figures and similar arguments in other publications for the EU as a whole. And I'm here notably referring to the high-level group of energy-intensive industries, which published an interesting master plan for decarbonizing energy-intensive industries a few months ago. Interestingly, also, one important aspect to consider is the impact those technologies and the decarbonization process would have on operating surplus. And you can see that for some of the sectors like steel, chemicals, for instance, just to take the share of energy cost would almost cover 60 to 80% of the operating surplus, meaning that without additional measures, there is no business case anymore for some of those sectors in Europe. Here you can see, I will accelerate a little bit because I see that the clock is ticking, but you will receive the slides, and these tables are from a report published recently by the Parliament, commissioned by the Parliament, but made by CE Delft. And again, you can see that the cost of the breakthrough technologies that can be used to decarbonize energy-intensive industries, the cost is quite important. So in a nutshell, even though there are still many uncertainties regarding the exact cost of those technological solutions to decarbonize energy intensive, there seems to be a consensus to acknowledge that those technologies will lead to additional costs across the board because of upfront investment, because higher OPEX, and because also of the needed infrastructure, notably CO2 pipelines, for instance, for CCS or CCUS, but it might also be adaptation of the electricity grid. And of course, this raises a series of questions, but the most important one is how to cope with those extra costs in the context of a globalized and open economy. We really believe that the carbon adjustment mechanism is one of the answers to that question. Now, I quickly move to the implementation and so to the how question. As you can see, many of the questions that I listed on the screen have been addressed already by, especially by Mathilde. But in 2 words, first, of course, the system must be in line and strictly compatible with WTO. We believe that there is a space to build a carbon border adjustment mechanism in line with the WTO rules. In terms of EU legal basis, we really believe important to have a mechanism and not a taxation. As Mathilde already said, a taxation would require unanimity, whereas a mechanism would allow to use the ordinary legislative procedure. And we really believe, again, it's maybe a point of discussion with Georg, but we really believe important to have a kind of coordination in the timing of the increase of the carbon price for the sectors covered by the EU ETS and the timing to implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism. In terms of sectoral scope, for us, it wouldn't make any sense to have a kind of macroeconomic general instrument. We need, at least at the beginning, to start with a targeted instruments targeted on the sectors like steel, basic metal, cement, basic chemicals, and electricity. That system must be dynamic and will have to be adapted in the future. Link with existing measures and notably the free allocation, we need to have maybe more granularity to be sure that the change in the system will not trigger this disruptive change. We might need an adaptation or transition period, but obviously we cannot accept to have 2 systems in parallel forever. It would generate windfall profits. This is something that we should avoid, but it might be also interesting to consider a hybrid system, for instance, having carbon border adjustment mechanisms for imports, but maybe to keep free allocation for exports. In terms of use of revenues, again, it will depend on what is on the table and the amount we are talking about, but we believe important to earmark some of the revenues and a significant part of those revenues to bridge the investment gap to accelerate the deployment of the technologies we need to decarbonize the energy intensive industries. The challenge is availability of data. It has been mentioned already. We can go back to that question in the discussion, but I think that there are a series of concrete ways to overcome that problem. The diversity of climate policy instrument in 3rd countries might be an important challenge because some countries might argue that they do not have a carbon pricing scheme comparable to what we have with the EU ETS, but that they use other policy instruments, standards, regulations, offsetting mechanisms, forestry or whatever, that have similar effects, and that focusing on simply the carbon pricing mechanism might be misleading and a way to distort international trade. The risk of retaliation measures has been mentioned already. It's not something vague, and we have experienced in the past such retaliation measures. Think about the reactions from the countries when the EU wanted to include all aviation within the ETS. And I think that maybe the most important risk, and it has been mentioned by Georg already, is the risk for downstream industries. For many industries, access to relatively affordable semi-finished products is a matter of competitiveness. So if we globally increase the price of those semi-finished goods, it might dramatically hamper the competitiveness of those sectors, and it might lead to offshoring, complete or more complex or longer value chains than well, what we have with the classical carbon leakage. So to conclude, so we see carbon adjustment mechanism as something that we must have to fully decarbonize energy intensive industries. We believe that discussion on the implementation details will be complex for all the reasons we mentioned. I want to make 3 remarks. It is not the silver bullet, and for us, carbon border adjustment mechanism versus other instruments, it's not an either or debate. We will need a wide portfolio of instruments, and carbon border adjustment mechanism is among those instruments, but maybe not the most important. Carbon pricing is not the main challenge which threaten the future of the energy-intensive industries. Those industries are currently struggling with a series of very, very serious challenges: dumping, overcapacity, COVID-19 consequences, etc. And last but not least, we believe that trade unions must be consulted at the different stages of the design of that instrument. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Benjamin. Can you stop sharing? Yeah.
I try.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I would now thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting, although you went a little bit out of your time, but it's okay. I would like now the panelists to maybe switch on their cameras so that we can see them for the last comments and questions. And I see that I think Georg wants to comment, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, because I wanted to give you also the possibility to comment on one another's presentations, if you wish, before we have a couple of questions. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, on Benjamin's point, I think all 3 speakers essentially agree on a lot of points about the complications, about the of implementation, about the need to increase carbon prices in Europe, and that we need to find a way to solve that. I think only in the solutions that we describe, we differ quite substantially. Now, I would like to have 2 minutes to explain a bit what alternative I would see to a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I mean, Benjamin made the point that indeed we want the targeted mechanism only for a few sectors where it's quite difficult to abate emissions now with current technologies, and he made his point very clear based on the Agora and other studies that indicate that. Now, I would argue these are sectors that are having characterized by high capital intensity, that are essentially have locked in investments, and they will continue operating because most of the cost is in the initial investments, and therefore, even if we introduce higher carbon prices now, most of them will continue operating in the European Union. At the same time, they have a long-term problem. As Benjamin lined out, there is a long-term issue in these sectors in terms of dumping in other countries, in terms of overcapacities and so on. And I would argue we get out of that with the approach that I would describe as creating new markets for clean products. So like we did for renewables at the time, where essentially Europe gave feed-in tariffs for green electricity and generated a completely new market. And this new market did not only result in clean energy production in Europe and allowed to introduce carbon prices in Europe because there was an alternative to switch away from coal, but it essentially brought also down the cost of clean energy production outside of Europe, and it enabled China and others to sign the Paris Agreement because they then knew that alternatives to dirty production are available. And if Europe takes the same role for cement, steel, and aluminium, for example, then we could do a real contribution to global decarbonization, and that's the whole purpose of this carbon pricing system that we have. we would at the same time increase the competitiveness of Europe in the long term in these sectors. We would make sure that those new plants in clean technologies are built here, and we don't need all the trouble that we might have with a carbon border adjustment mechanism that in my view can be a very, very risky exercise, as I lined out.
Yeah, thank you for this. Mathilde, do you want to say something on the two presentations? Because you were the first, you couldn't react. Yeah, we don't hear you. I think that you're muted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I agree many things that have been said and which complemented what I wanted to say too. So maybe to highlight the fact that, well, we are right now in a very challenging context with the Green Deal being implemented, and in fact, well, some analysis from the European Commission suggests that in the event that the EU trading partners do not align with the EU in terms of ambition, the challenging could increase for some EU industrial sector with the rising price of the carbon. So I'm not sure what you've been presenting, Georg, is completely reflecting the future of the situation. And all the literature that you've been presenting is more reflecting what has been happening since now. So I was wondering, what would you think about that?
Well, again, I think even literature on or case studies that we have on situations where you have very different input prices in highly energy intensive industries show that some of the industries stay where the market is and do not move outside of this perimeter. Just to give you one example that we found. Hydrogen is currently produced mainly with natural gas. In the US, you have hydrogen production both in California, and in Texas. And the gas price in Texas is essentially half of the gas price in California. And still, even so, the prices of natural gas essentially shifted from being the same 10 years ago to now being double in California than in Texas. Still, the level of hydrogen production in both areas stays the same, simply because the hydrogen is needed in California. So I would argue the installations are there. It's capital intensive. As long as the market is there for the product, a lot of the production will stay there. And I presume that we very much over exaggerate the problem. I think the industry has made big profits in the past of the free allowances. The free allowances are running out, so something new is being searched for. But I would not believe that that we will run out of a European steel industry or aluminum industry if we have significantly higher carbon prices, especially if we invest now in the low carbon alternatives to that, and essentially prepare ourselves for 2050, because we have to do this investment anyway. With the currently low margins, nobody is going to invest here in Europe. But if we take the green narrative and the green prerequisite to build now low carbon steel production in Europe, creating corresponding markets for green steel, green cement in Europe, then we might help the climate much more than with all carbon border adjustment mechanisms that run a very high risk of being captured by specific interests.
And maybe just to emphasize also that for me there is really an opportunity to use this all this discussion to launch negotiation with other countries about the carbon pricing and how to align the system that are being built in several regions in the world. And this might be maybe the most promising outcome of all this discussion, to try to build some not multilateral maybe because it's very, very difficult, but plurilateral system with a group of willing countries that would be ready to make some progress in that direction.
Yes, thank you. Maybe you have discussed and mentioned almost all the issues that people were asking about. So I'm not going to go into detail anymore about the design of this mechanism, because you're also not the designers of it. So it's a little bit maybe not the right stage here to have these discussions, but maybe there is an interesting proposal, and we haven't heard anything about that, like as an alternative. What do you think about the VAT, to incorporate this carbon tax in a VAT system, in the VAT system, as there is an example about California that implemented a low carbon fuel standard in 2007 with a baseline CO2 intensity number set for gasoline and diesel, including biofuels, and a life cycle analysis and indirect land use change was required to be undertaken by those who wanted to sell fuels in California. And each year the CO2 intensity was dropped by 1%. This led to predictable global reductions of greenhouse gas emissions from well to wheel. California also implemented a maximum CO2 intensity target for electricity, which was also based on mine to wire. And it was a success. So do we lack the tools to assess greenhouse gas intensity in products such as palm oil, cement, metals and composites, oil and gas? And VAT is a globally applied system for assessing compensating sales taxes on imports and exports. So will it not function just as well as the greenhouse gas intensity? Do you have any opinion on that?
Well, if I may,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my two colleagues mentioned before that the issue with taxation in Europe is quite a tricky one compared to California, because at the European level you require unanimity, which makes it much more difficult to get anything passed. I understand that the idea of VAT or a consumption taxation-based approach to carbon is being strongly discussed. So in Germany, for example, the Ministry of Economy has been discussing this idea. So maybe there is something to that, but the problem of measuring the carbon content remains, and I do not really see how you are able to solve that one.
Yeah, on the proposal, I don't know precisely that proposal, so keep look at what I'm going to say with some cautions, but like Georg, I have some doubt about the possibility to adopt such an instrument in Europe, given the rules we have. Pay attention also to the regressive impact that a tool such as VAT would have, especially on low income and middle income households. But I would also like to pay attention to the economic structure of California. What is appropriate to California, which is not really among the highly industrialized states in the US, might not be appropriate at all for countries or regions where with a stronger industrial background. So I would be extremely cautious about that, and I'm not sure I understand the idea, but I'm not quite enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, Mathilde.
Maybe we can also mention all the tools that has been envisaged in the EU, for instance, in the field of hydrocarbons. Several initiatives have attempted to introduce some specific mechanism via the European Directive on Fuel Quality, adopted in 2014, which provides for 6% reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels. But unfortunately, the scope of this text had been weakened under the Canadian pressure, amongst others, in the middle of the negotiation of CETA, the EU-Canadian trade agreement, because the initial draft envisaged allocating different carbon intensity values depending on the type of oil, and this component was abandoned. So we think that beyond the closure of the European market to this type of the product, the most polluting hydrocarbons would send a strong signal to investors in this sector. And here again, it's more normative way to answer the question than a mechanism or tax mechanism in Europe.
Yeah.
In terms of alternative, Maria, if I may, we briefly touched the issue during the presentations, but if you look at the emission trends of the energy-intensive industries for the last decade, it's really striking. It's flat. And we might argue that this is because the carbon price has been too low in EU. It's probably part of the answer. It might be also because the free allocation system really undermined the price signal and the environmental efficiency of the ETS. But it might also be because we are simply reaching the limits of a carbon pricing system as a policy instrument. And we might argue that now something else is needed. Another approach is needed, an approach more based on an industrial policy where the states and the public authorities take more leadership in investing in technologies, in investing in infrastructure, in adopting mandatory standards, in proposing mandatory public procurement regulations, that kind of instruments. I think that it would be interesting to enlarge a little bit the discussion to consider those instruments as well, which have been dramatically neglected in the climate field for the last decade.
Okay.
Reply to that, or maybe just one reply to Benjamin. I would be very careful with introducing discretionary mechanisms. I think the idea of what we have been proposing in terms of markets for clean products really is the idea of unleashing the forces of competition. And like for renewables, where there has been competition between different actors, and we might design even better mechanisms that make sure that the cost of those things don't explode. I think the government states are often not very good in finding the right things to invest into, so try to define things as broad as possible. But I also understand that we have to invest in learning, and for that we need extra payments beyond what the emission price is. But I would not take any discussion serious that wants to get rid of emission pricing, because we really need emission pricings at the margin. Because if you don't have any price for emissions anymore, then people will change their behavior. You will get in all sorts of rebound effects, and you will essentially kill all the success that you are doing with the investments through behavioral change of people. So therefore, we need a combined approach of supporting developing technologies, emerging technologies on the one hand, with a sensible carbon price. Otherwise, that thing is going to become extremely expensive and ineffective.
My point was not to scrap the ETS. Huh? My point was next to the ETS or on top of the ETS, other instruments might be needed. And I think that also some interesting initiatives have been launched or will be launched in the EU. If you look at what's happening under the umbrella of the EU industrial strategy, the launch of industry alliances, the launch of important projects of common European interest with state aid exemptions. Those elements kind of lead the EU towards a kind of EU industrial policy, even though it's not the industrial policy like we knew it in the 70s, 80s. It's interesting to see that it's much more proactive than what we had before, and it's not just leaving the decarbonization process to the market-driven instrument, which is the ETS.
Okay, I think we agree that we need many instruments next to each other, and that they need to be well thought and considering not only the European interest but also more globally. I think we should stop now because the discussion can go on, but we need maybe a second webinar on this. It was really a pleasure to have you with me today, and also to have so many attendees. So thank you very much that you shared with us your thoughts today about this important subject, and the slides and the recordings of the webinar will be posted on the ETUI website as usual, and you will receive an email also when they are available. I can already announce that the next and last webinar of the ETUI before the summer break will be next week on Wednesday, and the topic will be GDPR in digital labor platforms and the privacy issues of the COVID-19 contact tracing apps. I trust that many of you will be interested in these topics too, and will join us for this webinar. So goodbye and see you next time.